Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Keep Indiana Learning's book study. My name is Melissa Wally, and I am a digital learning coach with Keep Indiana Learning. If you are brand new to our book study, welcome. We're glad you're here. If you've been with us all along, we're thankful that you're back. Today's episode is a great one. We're focusing on Chapter 7 of UDL and Blended Learning by Katie Novak and Catlin Tucker. And this chapter focuses on assessments for and with learners. This was a really good one. I think it really touches on things that are very important that could be missed. So I really enjoyed reading this one myself. So a little bit about myself. I work for Hanover Community Schools in Cedar Lake up in the region as an educational technology specialist and tech coach. I've been in education for 25 years, and I pride myself on being a lifelong learner. So joining me today for our book study is my partner in crime, Diana Knox, as usual. And today's guest is no stranger to the UDL world, Brenny Coomer. Brenny, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. I'm so excited to be here today, everyone. My name is Brenny Coomer. As Melissa said, I'm from Columbus, Indiana, where I'm the Assistant Director of Educational Technology. I have been in this position for about 5 years now, and before that, I was a middle school and high school social studies teacher. I love talking about universal design for learning because I come from a UDL district, so love this book and love the opportunity to talk with you all today.
And I am Diana Knox. I am a technology instructional specialist for Clay Community Schools over in Brazil. This is my 25th year in education, which seems really hard to believe most days. And I am in my 7th in the educational technology world. So I look forward to these meetups where we get to break down these chapters and talk. I'm super excited to have Brenny join us today because I know she has a lot of experience and knowledge to bring to the table with UDL. So I'm always excited when I can learn from her. So let's jump right into breaking down assessments through that UDL lens.
So Katie opens up the chapter with one of her little vignettes, as we love. And this one is about assessment, and it's telling a story that could be told about by many of us, maybe with different topics and timelines, but it just rings true. It was for her, it was 2009, and she had attended a professional learning session or maybe a conference, and it was on UDL. Now, I didn't hear about UDL back in 2009. I heard about it much later than that. I won't go into when, but she was way ahead of me, obviously. So Katie was inspired by what she learned and then went back to her classroom with this idea of know better, do better, like many of us do. We go to this session, we're excited, we're going to go back and we're going to change the world. So she wants to create a universally designed assessment using the backward design process. And so the actual project that she had in mind were that kids were going to create these puppets. And that was going to be their assessment. And it involved paper doll cutouts, markers, glue, fabric, everything. And as you can imagine, I'm sure it got much bigger than what she envisioned. And she admits it just took way too much class time. It wasn't the strongest standards-based assessment, and it wasn't at all universally designed. And I think many of us, if not all of us, have been there. Like, we had this idea in our brain, we thought it was going to go one way, and it just went sideways. You end up knee deep in a project with students, and you're thinking, why did I even start this? It's not all what I expected. So she admits it was fun for the kids, though. And what ended up happening is that all of her effort on the creation of the project led to these missed opportunities for actually designing assessments for the learning. So she knew in it, like, I messed up. And I see that like the actual project, what she thought was the assessment was actually a distraction to what her intention actually was. So I love that story. Like she's there to say, like, here I was at the beginning, and we know where she is now. But here at the beginning, I wasn't perfect. I didn't know what I was doing, but I kept moving forward, and here I am now, and you're reading my book.
Yeah, I loved the intro for this section of the book, probably my favorite one, just because I appreciated the honesty. We've all been there. We've all had this idea, and we're like, this is going to be the best project ever. And maybe the kids really liked it, but looking back, we've all had that moment where we're like, why did I have students do that? That probably wasn't the best measurement of their learning. And maybe while it was fun, did it really connect to that learning goal or that standard? So I appreciate the honesty because, you know, these are UDL rock stars that are out there. And if they've kind of admitted some of their mistakes along the way, it makes it a little bit more humbling for all of us. So I will preface this by saying I have totally had a project like the Santiago puppets. Like I am not a perfect human being. I was a social studies teacher and I've had many activities where I was like, oh, this is going to be so great. I had students do a project one time where they made videos, and like making every single student do a video was not a great choice, especially with middle school students when they're very camera shy. But I learned about it at a conference and I was like, oh, this is the next best thing. And I definitely should have changed some of that. So with that being said, I love the focus of this chapter and that it really digs into the different types of assessments that we should have in our learning environments and ways of thinking about them so that they are more universal design for learning at their core. So moving from that story, Katie and Catlin dig into several different types of assessments. And if you are a research nerd and you love digging into that stuff, if you go into the back of the book where they kind of cite some of their sources, I love reading that part of a book because I'm a nerd. But I love that they included some data there about some researchers and faculty from the University of Toronto and how they describe formative assessment a little bit differently. And while assessments are supposed to be fun and they're supposed to be helpful for us as teachers, as checkpoints to see where our students are, I don't know if our students necessarily have that same excitement about formative assessments. And maybe it's a very intimidating process for them, but they're so important and they're so critical. So I love that these researchers from Toronto had kind of framed it as it's not just a formative assessment and a summative assessment. It's not something you just do a few times along the way and you have that big project or test or essay at the end. They broke it down as assessments of learning, assessments for learning, and assessments as learning, which I love that because when I think formative assessment, I think like a little quiz, but that's not really the only type of assessment that we need to have our students do. And if that's the only one we're thinking of, then we're probably leaving some students behind along the ways. So UDL really emphasizes formative assessments too. And I loved how they kind of brought that into the UDL lingo. If you're looking at the UDL guidelines, if you go to CAST's website and you're kind of looking through those checkpoints and the tips and things that are there, formative assessment is mentioned in several spots, actually, really on the engagement piece, that green column, it's mentioned there. It's also mentioned on the purple column, the very bottom, comprehension, and then also on the right-hand side, which is action and expression, which is the blue column. And it really focuses on formative assessment should guide the design of your activities moving forward. So UDL is all about planning ahead, being proactive. And so you use the information from formative assessment to hopefully guide more learning opportunities where you can identify where students need scaffolding or reframing your final project or summative assessment based on the information that you get from there. So I love that they included that UDL connection because I think it's something that is all over the guidelines, but it's not always as explicitly stated as what it could be. So other pieces that are really exciting from this section, and it is several pages long, I also love how they say that, okay, so she did the fun activity with the Santiago puppets and it was going to be cool and fun and maybe the students had a good time along the way. But when we think about implementing universal design for learning and we think about these formative assessment pieces, that it's not supposed to just be a fun meter. So not just building in formative assessments for fun's sake, but really focusing on how they connect to that learning goal. And Katie goes into focusing on how do you make an assessment? How do you drive your targets for your students in class. And that really is about digging into your academic content standards and unpacking them. So looking at your standards and your goals should really drive the design of all of those pieces. And I love that she frames them as your skills, your method, or your task-based goals and standards versus your content standards. And I think that's so powerful. I remember in my teacher prep program, we had to do all of this work in writing learning goals, and we had to write them a very specific way because this is what my professor said that they should look like. And every single time we wrote those learning goals, my professor said I had to explicitly state in that goal that this was how students were going to show their understanding. And then I get to my district, which is UDL district, and they say, what are you doing? You were never supposed to specifically say that this is the only way that students can show mastery of that goal. And that was just one of those mind-blowing moments for me as a teacher. And it just, totally changed my perspective. So I always ask people when I'm teaching people about UDL and we're talking about it is, what is your true learning goal? Is it a skills-based goal where students have to show steps in solving an equation, right? They need to be able to demonstrate those steps. Maybe the equation or the topic they're doing can be a little bit different. And if your learning goal is more of a content knowledge, so I taught social studies, so I always give those examples. But if I want my students to be able to explain the causes of World War II, like that's content knowledge, but there are so many different ways that they can explain something. So it's really digging in and focusing on what type of learning goal that you have and thinking about what are some different ways I can give students flexibility and options in that. And Katie gives some really good examples about her Old Man in the Sea activity with Santiago. And she says that there's so many ways they could have explained the themes of the story or the characterization of Santiago. And it was much more than that puppet. It could have been producing a video, writing an essay or a blog, or an infographic. So it's the same for a learning goal. They have to explain the character, but there's so many more ways to do that. And I just loved that section of the book and thinking about your learning goals and how they're different. If you're sitting here and you're thinking, because this always comes up when I talk to teachers about this, well, maybe I'm a math teacher, I'm a science teacher, and a lot of my goals are those skills goals where the students have to know how to do steps. They have to know how to follow through and do the scientific method and do a lab report. And that's okay. That's perfectly fine. We all have skills goals. If you are an ELA teacher or you're an elementary teacher and you have to teach students how to write an essay, that is a very skills-focused goal. So knowing that, where are some other places where we can provide some flexible options for students? So can we give them flexibility in scaffolding? So can they work with a partner? Can they work in a small group? Can I give them access to reference materials, tutorials, or guides to help them develop those skills and have those supports should they need them? Or can I give flexibility in the topic? So if I'm teaching students how to write a persuasive essay or an essay of any sort, maybe I give them options on the topic that they include on that essay, because ultimately they don't have a whole lot of degree and choice in the actual writing of the essay itself. So 2 questions that the authors talk about are what the learners need to know or be able to do, and then how will both the students and I know as the teacher know that they can do it. So that's really what you need to ask yourself as you plan out these pieces, and then think, am I embedding the means to reaching that goal? So if I'm saying you have to show your understanding of the causes of World War II by writing an essay, then am I giving choice by saying they have to write an essay and kind of removing that last piece and brainstorming some different ways to have students show mastery? Because ultimately, if we are thinking about those learning goals and we embed one way for them to show understanding, then my students are showing me how well they can write an essay or how well they can write a test, not necessarily just that content piece. And choice boards are certainly an amazing way to think about this. If that's where your mind is going, I am right there with you. I love choice boards. And think, are the options that I'm outlining for this choice board really demonstrating this learning goal too? Do I know how to effectively assess those different options? I know I have been guilty of making a choice board and I put some like QT fun things on there. And then I'm like, wait a second, is that really a good way for them to show their understanding? Like, do I know how to effectively assess that with my learning goal? So just keeping those in mind. And then from there, be creative, ask your students to come up with options and ideas as well.
Forgot to unmute there as I started talking. So, there's a rookie mistake for the day. Those are such important things to consider. And I think for many of us that had that same background in our prep programs where we were taught like there's this one way, it's hard sometimes to make that switch, especially if you're a teacher who has been teaching for many years and you've got this, these, I'm going to pick on my English teachers, and I was an English teacher once. They've got these like giant 3 or 4 inch binders of all of their stuff that they've perfected and mastered over the years. And so sometimes that flexibility I know can be uncomfortable at first. But it's really once they kind of explore and are okay to like fail forward a couple times, they really find a lot of growth there. So again, I loved my section that I'm going to talk about, which is assessment as an integral part of learning. It's not just an add-on. It's not something we do at the end of the learning series. It's one of those things that sometimes I think we need to kind of cycle through, and it's always an ongoing process. So if you've been following along with us on the journey through this book, we love those personal narratives that they interject into the chapter. They started with one about the Santiago puppets. And the one that I get to talk about is one of my favorites, where Catlin talked about attending a rigorous college prep high school. And that predominantly all of her assessments were one size fits all, summative assessments at the end of the learning that caused her a lot of stress and anxiety, that required hours of study and preparation, and then often felt punitive. And so, the ones that are the essay and the multiple choice, and my personal nemesis, the true false questions. And I think we've all been there. I can think of myself as a student. I know I felt this, that maybe the teacher was intentionally trying to ask a more obscure question that was maybe going to trip us up. And I will freely admit that as a teacher, there were a couple times I found myself like, I'm going to catch them. I'm going to see if they really know. I'm going to write this little detailed question. And was it really a part of the learning goal? Was it part of the standards? Probably not. And so it's one of those things that I think was an eye-opening piece for her to talk about it, because I could relate to it both as a student and very guiltily as a teacher as well. Catlin goes on to reflect that, even for herself as a beginning teacher, she fell into those same practices because we tend to teach the way we were taught. And that's comfortable for us. That's our experience. That's what we know. And for a lot of us, our college prep program just kind of reinforced that. And her perspective changed once she began to explore that blended learning idea and designing experiences that were for different groups of students with different needs. Using assessment as a driver of differentiation, which that's the teacher controlled part, but then that personalization component of it, which allows that partnership to form between the teacher and the student as you make those decisions of what is going to be a good way for them to have self-agency in choice that's going to make them more involved in the learning process. So in order to meet the needs of our students, we start with that pre-assessment or a diagnostic, and then we create ongoing opportunities for assessment throughout the process of teaching and learning so that we are informed to make necessary adjustments and modifications to maximize student learning of that ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve. And I love the figure on page 159 of the chapter that shows that cycle in action, and it's ongoing, it's continuous, it never stops. And so I think for me, my brain is thinking about ways I would do it differently in class. And then since I work predominantly with adults now, how can I do that with the professional development opportunities that I prepare for them? So.
And now I did it. Diana, you and I walk hand in hand all the time. Okay, so yes, like you said, what we do with our students, we, as those of us who provide professional learning for adults, we have to always think like, how are we now mirroring that as we provide that for our adult learners? It's just as important. When we talk the talk, we walk the walk as well, not just for modeling practices, but also because it's best practice. So we know that all of our students are not one size fits all. We don't get these paper dolls that come to us. Everybody's exactly the same. And then we just dish out our teaching practices, and then they move on to the next grade. Not only would that's not what happens. It's not realistic, but it also would be really boring. Students come to us with different background knowledge, experience, and diversity and abilities. And that's one of the things that just makes all of us humans unique. And as educators, we need to know where the students are when they come to us so that we know how to get them where we need to go along their learning path. So that's where that pre-assessment comes in. That will give us as teachers the knowledge for learning to understand that starting point. And the authors give some questions that sample what we as educators want to know about our students' backgrounds. What do they know? Obviously, we want to know that. What do they know about the content? But then also, where did that knowledge come from? And so that's some information. You can't get that from something they fill out. That just comes from digging deeper. What life experiences or skills, or their just worldviews are they bringing to the learning? And then what are their attitudes toward the specific topics or subjects? And some of that, like, not only is it beneficial to know that, but those are things that we can share with other students, even casually. I think bringing all of that diversity to your classroom is just beneficial for everyone. So you can use different strategies, both online and offline, to collect that data. And some is more formal. Some of your strategies are more formal. Some are more individual. Some are more group. And they do mention some strategies in the book. And then we also have the luxury that Brenny shared some of the strategies that she has used in the past. Brenny, do you want to talk about any of those just briefly?
Sure. So
maybe.
Yeah. So what's on the screen is actually an activity that we did kind of in a professional development setting, but you could totally do this individually, where you kind of do a brain dump, which is actually a pre-assessment activity, of all the different pre-assessment pieces that you have used, where you think of what it means for you. And then in the middle column there, we kind of crowdsourced some different ideas and strategies that teachers in my district have used and found success with, to give you some examples of what this can be. So to give you information on what your learners like, what they're excited by, and then also tapping into some of their existing content knowledge or skills related to your subject area.
Thank you. Yeah, and I love just like even the layout of that slide. I think that that's very user friendly. I think teachers would appreciate that. So the whole goal of the pre-assessment data, as I explained, it just is to inform teachers about how to best engage your students. And then additionally, teachers would be able to decide how to meet the different needs of students, choose your blended learning strategies, and ultimately make decisions to fit the needs of the class. How you choose to gain that is up to you. And then that data will determine if the class needs maybe more small group work, or if you just need to build that background knowledge a little bit more. And then those options are all critical to make sure that the learning meets the needs of the class so that they grow in the best way possible.
I almost did it. I almost started talking when I was We're on a roll today.
We sure.
All right. So my next section was about assessments as learning. So pre-assessment is kind of how you get to know your students and use that information to your advantage. And then formative assessments are the pieces that you integrate from time to time after you know what your students like, and you give them flexible ways for them to show their understanding so you can effectively design the summative and later on assessments. So I love that actually this section started off by them saying that formative assessments are informal, because maybe in my mind, I always think of like formative assessment means test, quiz, and then my anxiety levels go up just because I was a very nervous test taker in school. So kind of what we said here, that you kind of have like your experience as a teacher is very much shaped is your experience as a student. So I actually don't like even calling them formative assessments. I like even calling them just like formatives or formative fun. And I used to call them that with my students in class so that they wouldn't feel like it was a high stakes thing, because it's not. It's supposed to be low stakes.
I love that. That's such a neat idea.
Yeah,
I do too. And that sounds like an idea for like a quick PD, formative fun, and you can just have that conversation.
Yes, because even if you call your PD formative assessment, some people even are like, ooh, test quizzes. And I think we almost get into like that testing mode, and it's just nervous. So, you change your words, it changes your mindset. So I love to think about them in that way, just so it's not as much pressure on me as a teacher, but then also my students. And when you think about them in that light, but also putting on your UDL design thinking cap, know that whenever you give a formative fun or a formative, that it still needs to be flexible. So not every student is going to love raising their hand in class. And that could certainly be a way of gauging their understanding, but also think about what are some other avenues. So if we're doing something in class where students participate by verbally expressing it, can I set up a back channel chat or some type of discussion space so they could have that option if maybe they're a little shy or don't need that? And also considering that maybe having every single student do like a video as an exit ticket may not be the best choice as well. When it was Flipgrid actually was super popular and new, like I was like super into that and I loved the tool, but looking back, I was like, that maybe wasn't the best one size fits all approach for a formative assessment. I could have that as an option for students and maybe do some more of students writing out a response or verbally expressing it to me versus everyone doing a video. So what's on the screen are several different examples to get you thinking about formatives. And I love that the authors listed so many examples in the book that were no tech, low tech, and high tech. And I kind of curated some on this slide for you to explore. We called it a treasure hunt. So it's even more of like a fun little thing. So if you wanted, you could totally click through those resources. Some of them are from professional developments and workshops that we've led in my district, as well as some other instructional coaches in my district have used. And it's really a treasure trove of resources. It's anything from a more time-consuming type of formative to one that's just real quick you're doing right before the bell rings, or if you have a few extra minutes at the end of class. The authors list several examples, anything from a brain dump to a 3-2-1 activity where it's 3 things you learned, 2 things you have questions about, 1 thing that you want to explore further. You could certainly do some polls or surveys using tools like Pear Deck, Google Forms, Nearpod, or just low tech or on paper. I love another activity for a formative, and I didn't actually put it on there, but we had a colleague in the district that was a brand new teacher the same year I was, and we kind of buddied up. He was in a different building, and he came up with this awesome idea where they were called settle in activities. So it was almost like a choice board for formatives. So he used that to replace his traditional bell ringer, and he gave students 3 to 4 options, and he would reuse those kind of a couple times during the week. And it was really helpful for him. So he was an English language arts teacher. They were building some new vocabulary skills. So the students had options on that settle in activity to get them ready for the day. He had one where they played like a little Quizlet review game with the vocab terms they learned that week. Another one was where they talked with a friend and went through some flashcards and kind of wrote down how many they got right or wrong. And he had it all going on a spreadsheet. So he still got some data, and he got the Quizlet data for when they practiced. And then another one was them just talking through the vocab with him. And there was even a little like quiz option on there too. So I thought that was such a clever idea, and I kind of totally stole it and then used that in my social studies class for vocab. But it could be something that's pretty low stakes, like thumbs up, thumbs down type of thing, or it can be something like that. So I love that the authors gave so many good ideas, and hopefully you have some exciting ones. And if you do, you could totally share those with us. But really thinking about formative assessments as an analogy that the authors talked about in the book is a chef. You're adding in those different pieces when you're teaching, the spices and the flavors and the seasoning, and you're kind of like taste testing that throughout. So formatives are kind of giving you that guidance on what ingredients to add in next to your teaching and learning so that the students can have the best meal or best experience possible.
I love subtle inactivities. That it's amazing, and yet it's so natural.
Yes.
Yes.
I love it.
And I like the analogy of a teacher like using those same concepts as a chef would, because a chef would never ever prepare a dish and serve it up without having taste tested it at some point in the process to make sure that it was good. And they talk about how it's important to season it at all steps. And so, yeah, I love that. So the last type of assessment is assessments of learning. And those are the summative assessments that occur at the end of that learning cycle. And so there are three types of summative assessments. We have our traditional assessments, alternative assessments, and authentic assessments. Our traditional assessments are those that we're most familiar with. Your essays, your multiple choice, your true false, those kinds of things. They give teachers data, but they're often very meaningless to the students because the students don't really understand what they get out of it. They may not get any feedback for days or weeks. And then by the time they do get feedback, they're already onto something else. And so they don't know how to apply it, and they don't have that opportunity to go back and relearn or do something differently. Alternative assessments allow the students to share what they know through recordings, demonstrations, drawings, or some other flexible means. And so students are given agency in how they want to communicate what they know. So those can sometimes be effective as well. Authentic assessments give students a task relevant to their lives. And this is often called project or problem-based learning. And they challenge students to create a product that's a demonstration of their knowledge, their understanding, or their proficiency. And so when the students have that agency in what they are doing, it's meaningful to them, then they're actually more likely to invest time and energy into the task, which is going to produce a more robust product and a stronger demonstration of their knowledge. So with blended learning, we strive to give our students more control over time, place, pace, and path. And PBL leans right into that. They go hand in hand very, very comfortably. And so when our students are at the center of the learning process, they discover that learning can be very messy sometimes, but it's a rewarding process. So I really like thinking of it in terms of that. And I think that's the scary part for teachers sometimes too, the mess, because sometimes chaos doesn't look like there's something effective going on. And, you know, depending on your administrator and how they feel, sometimes even just that process of first exploring and embracing the mess and the chaos, it can just be awkward. But it just kind of dive right in there, and the chaos can be beautiful. So I loved that at another point in the chapter, when we really started talking about PBL, they started talking about the gold standard of PBL and things that you would see within a project. So the 7 design elements that have to be present for a task to be considered that gold standard, to get that gold star, we would have a challenging problem or question that has sustained inquiry. There's authenticity to it, student voice and choice in the process. There's a reflection piece, and then critique and revision to create that public product. And if you think about it, life is like that. We're always constantly reflecting, revising, improving. And so when we do this, our students are going to develop a richer knowledge and the specific skills, and that we're able to assess the public product as progress towards those stated learning objectives that we have for them. So I think that's just a great way to look at the assessments of learning.
Yeah, and I like that you included that piece about PBL, because for many of us, that is another initiative in our districts at this time. So that's important to incorporate as well. And not as a separate piece, but when we add something, when we add another initiative, we are adding as incorporating, not like we have this bucket over here, this bucket over here. We should just be all working together. And you mentioned the word awkward. And as you said that, I was like, oh, that's my next topic. Speaking of awkward, what about the grades? We can't ignore the fact that we have to be able to measure and report our student learning, and we don't have to go into the reasons why. We know it's important. But the way that we are grading student assessments should be transparent and competency-based, and most importantly, clearly communicated to the students. We know oftentimes it's the parents that want their hands on those grades, but the students are really the ones that need that communication. And they shouldn't be surprised about their grades that they're receiving, but they also shouldn't feel confused or unsure about where that grade came from or why they got it. Because essentially grades should not be a gotcha. And not only is this fair to them, but it also creates that sense of self-awareness when it comes to their learning and about their own strengths and needs. And it's okay to have needs. And I think that's a big part of this, is that they're learning that I'm not perfect. I don't always have to have straight A's and 100s. And it's impossible to think that about yourself. So it gives the student the ability to feel in control of their learning, and then they know what they need to do to improve. And here are some steps that I can do to better myself. And I really like this part because I think it's so important that students feel this way, and not just academically, but when they know that they are supported by the adults around them and they feel that trust, they learn how to communicate their needs and concerns about their learning. And that's how they learn to self-advocate, not just when it comes to their learning, but in all areas of their life. And I feel like those skills are going to serve them well in life, and they're just going to learn to apply them in different areas when they become older, when they are in college, and when they have a job, and in relationships. And the earlier that we start putting them in control of their own academics and life and relationships, the stronger that their skills will be.
I love that idea. I think back to students I had in class that they put so much pressure on themselves for a perfect score that really may or may not have been a good assessment of their learning, or they would be so angry at themselves if they made a mistake and missed one. And they want to argue with me and debate with me, like they wanted that. And I kept saying, like, guys, like, life is lived in shades of gray. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to learn from those mistakes. It's not, the world is not black and white all the time. And so putting them in control earlier, where they see a different way to assess and learn that process of revision and that, that failing forward kind of concept to work to constantly improve. I think that's so valuable for them to be successful.
Well, and I think the students that maybe aren't maybe the strongest, they can learn, like, okay, here's where I am, but here are some steps I can take. And then they see that improvement, and then they know, like, oh, what I'm doing is working.
Yes.
So I think that is equally as important as well.
Agreed. I just want to like snaps to all of the stuff you guys are saying. I love it. And that actually segues really well into my next section, which is about assessments with learners. So I love that, Melissa, you had mentioned that it's so important that students are included throughout this process and have that agency and have that feeling of trust and acceptance that it's okay to fail forward. That's a part of learning. And ultimately, our learning environments are for the students. Everything we design should be for them. I know that, like, classroom, like, this is our room, this is our space, but really it's the student space. So giving them opportunities to have those conversations and reflect and feel empowered to advocate for themselves should really be the end goal, no matter what we're teaching. And I think that the authors do a really good job about talking about the student's role in assessments and doing assessments with learners. And I did not know this before reading this section of the book. And I was kind of like, wow, I clearly did not pay a whole lot of attention to like root words and meanings and things. But the root word and meaning of the word assessment actually means doing something with someone, sitting alongside them, versus doing something to them. And I think back and I'm like, gosh, assessments were always something that seemed like they were being done to me, like a test or a quiz or an essay. Those blue book tests that you had to take in undergrad where you had like 2 hours to write. Oh my gosh, I would get so nervous. Yeah, like it just like, woo, makes my heart race just thinking about those. That was something that, was done to me, but that's not really what assessment should be. It's to be something with students. So when we have these formative assessments and we have those opportunities for conversations with students, we need to really capitalize on those. And if you're thinking, how do I do an assessment with the student? The 4 blended learning models that they talk about throughout this book give you so many ways to reframe the design of your lessons and activities so that you as the teacher are kind of freed up and you can clone yourself and kind of be in multiple places at once and have those side-by-side conversations with students. So as they're working on an essay or as they're working on that project, or if they're engaging in project-based learning and doing this really amazing activity, if you use those blended learning models, then you can check in with them and kind of think out loud and talk them through the questions that you have, areas where they maybe could add a little bit more, or maybe where they need to have some more growth because they're not quite on track. And then that goes the same way for the students too. So having those structured conversations and letting the students think aloud about questions that they have. And I love that section of this book because I'm always reading and I'm asking like, okay, I'm buying what you're selling, but how does that actually look like in the learning environment? And this was just such a eye-opening piece that talking with students throughout this whole learning journey is so key. And I don't feel like I always did the best job of that during projects. Like I would float around and try, but I wish I would have known about some of these blended learning models so that I could have had more of those structured coaching opportunities with my students.
Absolutely. Well, gosh, we could probably talk all day long about a whole lot of this, but our time together is really winding down, and there was so much great content. Really, this entire book, I can't say enough good things about this book as a starting place for your journey to kind of go down. And they give, as Bernie said, those real world things that you can see it in action, you can envision it. And that's the piece that I miss sometimes from the articles that I read that talk about things we ought to be doing. Catlin and Katie break it down and like actually kind of show us how it could look. And I need that. That's my learning style. It fits it very well. So as we have done in the past, we are going to take those reflection questions at the end of the chapter. And we've got one we want to leave you with. And that is going back to the Santiago Puppet Project. As you're kind of starting to think about assessments and putting that UDL lens on and all of the things that we talked about with assessments of learning, as learning, for learning, think about that Santiago Puppet Project. And it was an example of a one-size-fits-all project, probably something that you have maybe a lot of hanging around in your back pocket. But if you could start that process of identifying alternative and more authentic ways that students could share how they met the goal of the lesson. So that's kind of the reflection we want to leave you with as we get ready to wrap up our time together. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this chapter and on our slow book study with Keep Indiana Learning. We have special thanks to Bernie Coomer for joining us today. I always enjoy any conversation I can take part in with her because she has so much to bring to the table. So thank you, Brenny.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was wonderful. I love it.
So if you are joining us for the first time, just remember that you can catch up with our other chapters on the Keep Indiana Learning YouTube channel. You can scan that QR code, take you right there to the playlist if you would like. And then we're going to see you back here again in a couple of weeks for chapter 8. So have a great day.